In a forgotten village, silence hides a deadly secret. Every week, someone vanishes without a trace. Whispers rise from an ancient well, shadows crawl in the mist, and fear binds every soul. When a stranger arrives, the curse awakens, and the line between savior and sacrifice begins to blur. Before continue, please like this video and subscribe to my channel. That's free and only way to support us. Thank you. The village sat like a forgotten scar on the map, tucked between forests so dense that daylight barely touched the ground, and fields that stretched on until they melted into fog. The air always felt heavy there, like it carried something unsaid, something that pressed against the chest and whispered, "Don't stay too long." Travelers rarely passed through, and those who did often hurried along the dirt paths without stopping. But for the people who called this place home, leaving was never an option. The houses were built from stone so old it seemed they had been dragged from the earth itself. Roofs sagged under the weight of moss and years, and wooden doors creaked like bones each time they opened. The streets were narrow and always smelled faintly of damp soil and smoke. A river curled through the land, dark and sluggish, carrying fallen branches and the occasional dead animal down its path. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. Children still played in the mud when the sun rose, their laughter echoing off the walls. Farmers carried baskets of grain, their backs bent but steady. Women fetched water from the river, gossiping in low voices. To an outsider, it looked like any other, poor but stubbornly surviving settlement. But something was wrong, terribly wrong. Every week, one person disappeared. It was not loud. There were no screams tearing through the night, no signs of blood staining the cobblestones. People just vanished. A man might walk into the fields to cut hay and never return. A mother might send her daughter to fetch firewood, only for her footsteps to fade and never come back. Sometimes it was the elderly, sometimes the young, sometimes a visitor foolish enough to stay overnight. The strangest part was how the villagers reacted. When someone went missing, they didn't search. They didn't call for help or organize hunts in the forest. They stayed quiet. Faces turned grim, lips pressed tight, and they carried on as though it had been expected all along. Every week, like clockwork, one soul gone, swallowed into the silence. The people rarely spoke of it, but when they did, it was only in hushed tones after dark. They never said the names of the lost aloud. It was as though naming them might draw the same fate upon their own heads. Children, curious and bold, would sometimes ask, "Where did Uncle go? Where did my sister go?" And their mothers would silence them with sharp glares or the back of a hand. "Don't speak of it," they would whisper, their voices trembling. The few who had tried to leave the village never returned. Some packed their belongings in the dead of night, slipping away with carts and horses. Others ran, their fear driving them to sprint across the forest paths. Not one was ever seen again. Not in the village. not beyond it, as though the land itself swallowed them whole. At the center of the village stood an ancient stone well. Its stones were blackened with age, slick with moss, and its mouth yawned wide like an open wound. No one used it for water anymore. The river served that purpose well enough. But still, the well remained, untouched, yet never abandoned. It was impossible to ignore, standing tall in the middle of the square, casting shadows that always seemed too deep. Children were warned never to play near it. "Stay away," parents would say, fear sharp in their voices. "Don't go near the well. Don't even look too long." They never explained why. They didn't have to. The children already knew. At night, when the streets grew empty and the wind howled through the trees, whispers drifted from the well. Soft, low, too many voices speaking at once, as though the darkness below carried an audience that never slept. Some villagers swore the whispers grew louder when someone's time was near. Others claimed they had seen pale hands brush against the rim of the well at dusk, fingers slick and dripping as though they had crawled out of the river itself. But no one dared to investigate. Not anymore. The old men of the village would sometimes sit by their fires and murmur to each other about the past. About promises made long before anyone living could remember. About debts that were still being paid. When the young asked, the elders would go silent, staring into the flames with eyes full of secrets. The strangest thing was how life still continued despite it all. Fields were tended, marriages celebrated, babies born. And yet, every week when the sun set on the chosen day, the air in the village changed. People locked their doors tighter. Mothers pulled their children close. The streets fell into silence, the kind that rang louder than noise ever could. And in the morning, without fail, someone would be gone. A village where time stood still. A village that lived with fear as naturally as breathing. A village where every week a soul vanished into the unknown, and no one dared to ask why. Please like this video, comment your thoughts, and subscribe this channel. Its stones were rough and blackened, worn down by centuries of weather, yet they never crumbled. Ivy clung to its sides like bony fingers, twisting and curling, as if the plants themselves were trying to strangle whatever lived inside. The villagers never touched it, never leaned against it, never even dropped a coin for luck. The well was not a place of hope. It was a place of dread. By day, it was unsettling enough. Children who dared glance too long swore the air above it shimmered, like heat rising from the earth even on the coldest mornings. Animals refused to drink from it. Dogs growled when dragged near, tails tucked low. Crows perched on the rim sometimes, but they never stayed long. They always flew off in a rush of wings, squawking as if chased by something unseen. But it was at night that the true terror began. When the moon hung low and the village fell into silence, the well spoke. Not in clear words, but in murmurs. whispers, many voices layered over one another, weaving together like a dark hymn carried on the wind. If you stood close enough, you could swear you heard your own name spoken softly from the depths. And if you stayed too long, the voices would grow sharper, calling you, beckoning you, pulling you closer to the rim. No one ever admitted to listening, but everyone had heard them at least once. And they all knew the rule: never answer, never lean in, never whisper back. The oldest woman in the village, Ilara, had lived through more disappearances than anyone could count. Her hair was white as snow, her back bent like a broken branch, but her eyes still burned sharp. She was the one who said the well was cursed. She told the children stories in hushed tones, stories they were not supposed to hear, yet clung to anyway, because children always chased the forbidden. According to Ilara, long ago, when the village faced a famine so cruel that even the river dried and the fields cracked into dust, the people grew desperate. They had prayed to God, but no answer came. And so they turned to the well. They believed something lived inside it, something older than their gods, something hungry. To save themselves, they made a bargain. One life a week in exchange for food, water, and survival. And it worked. Rain came, the fields grew, the cattle thrived. The famine ended, and the people celebrated. But the bargain was not temporary. It was forever. The well wanted more. Always more. Always more. The villagers learned quickly that ignoring the bargain brought disaster. One week, when no one disappeared, the fields turned black with rot overnight. The next, the river spilled over, drowning half the houses and leaving bloated fish scattered across the dirt. After that, no one questioned it again. 1 soul a week, paid in silence. Ilara claimed that was why no one dared leave. The pact was not with the village, but with the land itself. It did not matter if you crossed forests or mountains. The curse followed. Once tied to the well, always tied. Most of the younger villagers mocked her stories. They whispered under their breath when she passed, laughed at her warnings, and tossed stones at her house when the moon was full. But deep down, when they lay awake at night and the whispers from the well crawled into their ears, even the boldest of them shivered under their blankets. Because Ilara's words might be nothing more than myths. Or they might be truth. The families of the disappeared never spoke of their lost ones again. It was not grief that silenced them, but fear. Naming the missing was believed to draw attention from the voices, to mark you as next. A woman once screamed her son's name into the air after he vanished. She cried and shouted until her voice was raw. The following morning, she too was gone, her bed empty, the door locked from the inside. After that, no one ever broke the silence again. Strangers who passed through the village felt it too. The tension, the way conversation stopped when the well was mentioned. the way villagers' eyes darted toward it when the wind blew in strange patterns. Some strangers mocked them, saying it was superstition, just fear passed down. A few of those strangers even tried to peer into the well, daring it to scare them. None of them ever left the village. The well was more than a piece of stone. It was a reminder, a debt carved into the land. And every whisper that rose from its depths was a warning. The bargain is not over. And so the well remained, silent by day, alive by night. The center of the village and the center of its curse. The villagers avoided its shadow, yet no one dared to tear it down. Perhaps they feared that destroying it would release whatever lived below, loosing it upon the world. The well waited, and every week, without fail, it claimed what it was owed. The first frost of autumn had begun to creep into the fields when a stranger wandered into the village. His boots were caked with mud, his cloak torn from brambles, and his eyes sharp, as though they belonged to a man who trusted no one, not even the ground beneath his feet. He gave his name as Adrian, though some swore later that he never truly said it. It was simply the name they chose for him, because something about him did not feel like it belonged. Adrian claimed he was only passing through. He had been on the road for weeks, he said, traveling between towns, searching for work, or maybe just a bed that didn't smell of rot. The villagers listened politely, but their silence was thick. Strangers rarely came, and when they did, they rarely stayed. Still, the innkeeper, a gaunt man with eyes too tired to argue, gave Adrian a room and a loaf of bread. From the moment he stepped into the square, Adrian felt the weight of the village. Not just the suspicious stares of its people, but the air itself. It pressed on him, heavy and damp, as though he'd walked into a place where the world had been holding its breath for centuries. And at the center of it all, the well. He had noticed it immediately. A dark mouth gaping in the middle of the square, its stones black with age, its shadow stretching far longer than the morning sun should allow. Even as he ate, even as he warmed his hands by the fire, his eyes kept drifting back to it through the inn's window. He had seen wells in many towns before, but none that carried the same pull. This one looked alive. That night, as he lay on the straw mattress in his small room, Adrian tried to sleep. But the village was too quiet. No dogs barked, no owls called. The silence was unnatural, like the pause between a predator's breath and its strike. He tossed and turned, his body weary, but his mind restless. And then he heard it. At first, it was faint, like a thread pulled through the fabric of silence. A whisper, low and soft, almost tender, curling through the cracks of the window shutters. He held his breath, straining to listen. Another whisper followed. Then another. Dozens of voices layered together, weaving like water slipping over rocks. Adrian sat up, heart thudding. The voices weren't outside his window. They were calling from deeper in the village. Drawn by something he couldn't explain, he lit his lantern and crept out into the street. The air was cold enough to sting, and fog curled around the cobblestones like smoke. The whispers grew louder with every step, not sharp, but beckoning, like a mother coaxing her child closer. The sound led him unshakably to the square. There it was, the well. Even in the dark, its stones glistened wet, though no rain had fallen. The lantern's light trembled as Adrian lifted it, trying to pierce the shadows below. But the light seemed to vanish, swallowed the weight by the endless black. And still the whispers rose, curling around him, brushing against his ears, crawling into his skull. For a moment he swore he heard his own name. He stepped back, shaking his head. "No," he muttered to himself. But as soon as the word left his lips, the whispers shifted, sharper now, layered with laughter. A chill ran down his spine. He spun around, lantern held high. That's when he felt it. A touch. Cold, wet, and impossibly real. A hand brushing across his shoulder. He staggered back, the lantern swinging wildly. Its light sliced through the fog, revealing only empty streets. No one. Nothing. The houses loomed silently, shutters closed tight. The village slept, unaware or unwilling to see. Adrian's breath came quick, fogging in the air. His heart raced, yet some part of him wanted to lean over the rim, to listen closer, to answer. But instinct pulled him away. He stumbled back from the well, his lantern barely keeping the darkness at bay, until at last he reached the inn and slammed the door shut behind him. Sleep never came. He sat awake until dawn, the whispers still echoing in his ears. The next morning, when the sun rose weakly over the fields, the village stirred with unusual quiet. Faces were pale, eyes darting nervously. A name spread in hushed voices. Mara, a young woman, no more than 20, had gone missing in the night. Her mother wept at the doorway, clutching an empty shawl. Her father stood frozen, as though his body had been hollowed out. Yet the other villagers did not gather to search. They did not run into the fields or call for help. They simply bowed their heads and returned to their work, their silence heavier than grief. Adrian watched in disbelief. Mara was gone, and no one moved to save her. No one even asked. He tried to question them, but every time he did, their eyes slid away, their lips pressed into thin lines. Finally, one old man muttered under his breath, "It was the week's turn." Adrian's blood ran cold. He thought of the whispers, the hand on his shoulder, the laughter echoing from the well. The village had secrets, secrets no one dared to speak. And Adrian, the stranger, had just stepped into the middle of it. Please like this video, comment your thoughts, and subscribe this channel. Mara's absence spread across the village like a shadow that refused to lift. By the time the sun climbed over the hills, her name was already on everyone's lips, whispered but never shouted. People carried on with their routines, feeding livestock, fetching water, sweeping their thresholds. But every face was pale, every eye darted toward the square, as though the well itself might suddenly call them next. Adrian couldn't stop staring at Mara's family. Her mother sat hunched on the doorstep, clutching a wool shawl to her chest, the tears on her cheeks already dried into thin, salty streaks. She didn't scream. She didn't beg for help. She simply rocked back and forth, humming to herself, as if her voice might soothe a wound that could never close. Her father stood behind her, one hand pressed against the wooden doorframe, his face empty, hollow. Adrian's stomach turned. He had seen death before, on battlefields, in sickness, in famine, but never like this. Here, grief was not raw or loud. It was silent, resigned, as if they had known this day would come, as if they had accepted Mara's fate long before she was gone. That silence infuriated him. "You're just going to do nothing?" he demanded, his voice sharper than he intended. A few villagers turned to look at him, eyes narrowed, but no one answered. "Where is she?" he pressed. "When did anyone last see her? She couldn't have just vanished." A woman carrying a basket of bread glanced at him, then lowered her gaze. A group of men who had been mending a fence set their tools down quietly, their shoulders stiff, their lips unmoving. Only an old man, his back bent and his eyes clouded with cataracts, muttered from the edge of the square. It was the week's turn. Adrian froze. The words rang in his ears, cold and certain. He stepped toward the man. "What do you mean, the week's turn?" The old man's jaw clenched. He didn't repeat himself. He simply shuffled away, leaving Adrian with more questions than answers. That night, sleep didn't come. Adrian lay awake on the straw mattress, the walls of the inn pressing in on him, every creak of wood sounding like footsteps. The memory of the whispers at the well returned, curling into his ears, wrapping around his thoughts. When exhaustion finally dragged him into sleep, he dreamed. Mara stood at the edge of the well, her shawl hanging loose around her shoulders, her face pale in the moonlight. She didn't look afraid. She looked empty, like a puppet waiting for strings to move her. Her lips moved, forming words Adrian couldn't hear. He strained, leaning closer, trying to catch the sound. Then she lifted her head. Her eyes were black, hollow. Water trickled from them, streaming down her cheeks. When she smiled, her mouth stretched unnaturally wide, and the whispering voices roared in his ears. Before he could move, her body collapsed like melting wax, dissolving into a torrent of water that poured into the well. He tried to run, but his legs wouldn't move. The water spread, filling the square, dragging him toward the rim. He woke, gasping, his throat dry, his skin damp with sweat. Morning came, but it brought no answers. Mara's family shut their doors tight. Her friends avoided Adrian's questions. The villagers carried on as if she had never existed. But Adrian couldn't shake the dream. He couldn't shake the feeling that the whispers weren't just sounds. They were memories, fragments of the missing calling out from below. Later that day, he caught sight of Ilara, the old woman the others mocked as a witch. She sat on her porch, knitting with trembling hands, her eyes never leaving the well. Adrian approached her cautiously. "You knew this would happen," he said. Her hands stilled. She looked up at him, her eyes sharp despite her age. "Of course, the well always takes what it's owed." Adrian's fists clenched. "You speak as if it's normal, as if her life meant nothing. You speak as if it's normal, as if her life meant nothing." Ilara's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. Her life meant everything. That is why the well wanted it. It always takes the bright ones first. Adrian felt a chill crawl down his spine. "What is it? What's inside the well?" Ilara's gaze drifted back to the square, to the ivy-covered stones that pulsed with shadows even under the sun. Her voice was low, barely more than a whisper. "It is hunger, hunger given shape. It feeds, and in return it lets us live. That is the way it has always been. That is the way it will always be." Adrian wanted to argue, to shout that it was madness, that no one should accept such a fate. But her words rang with the same heavy truth he had seen in the villagers' eyes. They weren't surviving despite the disappearances. They were surviving because of them. That night, as the village went to sleep, Adrian found himself drawn back to the square. The well loomed in the darkness, the whispers curling up like smoke, softer now, almost gentle. He stood at its edge, his lantern light swallowed by the blackness. And then, faintly, he heard her. Mara, her voice, clear, calling his name. The morning after Mara's disappearance, the village square was strangely still. Even the birds that usually nested in the crooked roofs had gone silent. Adrian sat on the inn's steps, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, though he'd barely slept at all. The whispers had clung to him all night like cobwebs in the mind. Mara's voice among them, calling his name, softer than breath, but sharper than a blade. He hadn't told anyone, but his skin still tingled where he swore the cold hand had touched him by the well. He couldn't shake it. He couldn't ignore it. And unlike the villagers, he had no intention of pretending it didn't exist. That was when she appeared. Ilara. The old woman moved through the morning fog like she had grown from it, her crooked spine bending her form, her steps slow but steady. She carried a cane carved from twisted wood, though it looked more like a staff than something for support. Her hair was a tangled halo of white, her skin creased like ancient parchment, and yet her eyes were sharper than Adrian's own. They phoned him at once, pinning him as if she had been waiting. "You've heard them," she said, her voice low and rough like gravel underfoot. Adrian froze. "What?" Her lips curled into something between a smile and a sneer. "The voices. Don't bother lying. I can see it in your face. You heard the whispers, didn't you? You followed them." Adrian swallowed hard, glancing around. A few villagers were already watching from behind half-closed shutters, pretending to sweep or feed chickens, though their eyes never left the square. He nodded once. Yes, I heard them. I saw. He hesitated, then lowered his voice. Mara, please like this video, comment your thoughts, and subscribe this channel. Elara's hands tightened around her cane until her knuckles turned white. She stepped closer, her breath faintly smelling of herbs and smoke. Then listen to me. Don't answer. Don't lean in. Don't let them pull you any closer than you already are. Because once they have your ear, they will want more. And once they have your name, they will never let go. Her words sank into him like stones dropped in water. Adrian stared at her, his jaw tightening. What are they? He asked. Elara's gaze flickered toward the well. Not ghosts, not demons, not anything your books or priests can name. Hunger, that's what it is. Hunger with a voice. She lowered her tone until he had to lean in just to hear her. Long ago, when famine rotted the land, our ancestors begged for salvation. The well answered. Food returned, rain fell, cattle thrived. But in return, it demanded blood. One soul each week. That was the pact. Adrian's chest burned. And you still honor it? You just let your people die? Her eyes snapped back to his, blazing despite her frailty. Do you think they vanish quietly? That they walk into the mist willingly? No, they are taken, chosen. You can fight it all you like, but the hunger does not care for your defiance. The moment the bargain was struck, it bound us all. Those who try to leave never make it past the forest. The curse follows them, tearing them apart until not even bones remain. The well is not just ours, it is tied to the land itself. Adrian's stomach twisted. He thought of the strange symbols he had seen carved into the trees when he first entered the forest. Of the eerie silence that seemed to smother everything here. It wasn't just superstition. There was something alive beneath their feet, something watching. He clenched his fists. So you all just wait your turn? Elara's expression softened, sadness bleeding into her sharpness. We endure, because the land gives as much as it takes. Without it, none of us would survive. She stepped closer still, her voice dropping to a near whisper. But you, stranger, you are not bound like we are, and yet the well has already noticed you. It touched you, didn't it? Adrian's throat went dry. He didn't answer, but his silence was enough. Her hand shook as she gripped his arm, her nails sharp against his skin. Listen to me. Leave tonight before it claims you, before it whispers your name into the dark. Her words echoed in him long after she had gone, hobbling back to her crooked little house at the edge of the square. That night, the village fell into its ritual silence again. Windows shuttered, doors bolted, not a sound but the creak of old wood. Adrian sat awake, lantern flickering beside him, every muscle tight. The whispers began as they always did, soft and distant, like wind through reeds. But this time, there was no doubt. The voices knew him. They didn't just murmur. They spoke. Adrian. His blood ran cold, and when he closed his eyes, Mara's pale face swam into view, her lips moving slowly, carefully. This time he heard the words, "Join us." The next morning, Adrian woke with his jaw clenched so tightly it ached. He had barely slept, the whispers gnawing at the edges of his mind long after the night had passed. Mara's face, her pale, hollow eyes, her lips parting with that terrible invitation, haunted him with every blink. He couldn't sit still anymore. If the villagers wanted to bow their heads and pretend, that was their choice. But Adrian was not born to bow. Something inside him, anger, defiance, maybe just sheer stubbornness, pushed him to seek the truth. And he knew exactly where he had to go. The forest. The villagers avoided it, always muttering about shadows and curses whenever its name came up. But to Adrian, the forest was the only place untouched by their silence, the only place where the answers might lie. So, at dawn, when the mist still clung low to the ground, he strapped his satchel across his shoulder, lit his lantern, and walked toward the trees. The moment he crossed the edge of the village, the air changed. It grew colder, heavier, as though he'd stepped underwater. The forest loomed with twisted branches that arched overhead like ribs, their leaves whispering secrets to one another in voices the wind carried. Sunlight tried to pierce through, but the canopy smothered it, turning day into a dim twilight. The deeper he went, the quieter it became. Birds stopped singing. The crunch of his boots on the dirt felt too loud, echoing back as if the forest itself was listening. Adrian tightened his grip on the lantern, his heart beating like a drum. That was when he saw them. Please like this video, comment your thoughts, and subscribe this channel. Symbols carved into the bark of the trees. Deep gouges that spiraled into strange shapes. Neither words nor pictures, but something in between. They pulsed faintly in the shadows, as though light moved beneath the bark itself. Adrian reached out, his fingers brushing one, and a chill shot up his arm so violently he staggered back. The mark burned cold, like ice pressed straight against his skin. His breath quickened, but he pressed on. The path twisted and coiled, leading him farther from the village than he realized. And then, after what felt like hours, he stumbled into a clearing. At its center stood a stone altar. Crude, jagged, its surface stained dark with something that time had not erased. Moss grew thick across its base, but the top was bare, the stains stark against the grey. Adrian's stomach turned as he stepped closer. Bones were scattered around it. Not animal bones, these were human. Long femurs bleached white, ribs cracked open, skulls with empty sockets staring back at him. He knelt, his hands trembling, and spotted something half buried in the dirt. He pulled it free, a pendant. Simple, strung with a broken chain. Mara's pendant. His pulse thundered in his ears. She had been here. She had been taken here. The forest groaned suddenly, a sound like wood twisting under unbearable weight. Adrian's head snapped up. Adrian's head snapped up. The air thickened, pressing against his chest. He scanned the trees, his lantern trembling in his grip. Shadows rippled between the trunks, moving faster than the wind, darting just out of reach. A branch cracked behind him. He spun, but no one stood there. Only the trees, their twisted arms swaying gently. He stumbled back, his heel striking against the altar. The moment his skin touched the stone, the whispers roared to life, louder than they had ever been. Mara, Adrian. So many voices, male, female, young, old, all layered together, surging like a tide. He clutched his ears, but the sound came from inside, burrowing into his skull. His vision blurred, the clearing spinning around him. For a moment, he saw faces in the shadows, dozens of them, all familiar, all hollow-eyed. The missing. The villagers who had vanished week after week. Their mouths moved in unison, chanting in a language that rattled in his bones. Then, as suddenly as it came, it stopped. Adrian gasped, his knees buckling. The clearing was silent again. The bones lay still, the altar looming, the trees swaying gently as if mocking him. He staggered to his feet, gripping the pendant so tightly the chain dug into his palm. Something was terribly wrong with this place. The well wasn't just some hole in the ground. It was tied to the forest, to this altar, to the land itself. The pact Elara had spoken of wasn't just whispered superstition. It was carved into the earth. As Adrian stumbled back toward the path, his lantern flickered. The flame stretched unnaturally long, pulling toward the altar like it was being sucked in. For a heartbeat, Adrian swore he heard a laugh, low, guttural, rolling through the clearing. He didn't look back. He ran. Branches whipped his face, roots clawed at his boots. But he didn't stop until the village roofs came into view through the mist. He stumbled into the square, his chest heaving, the pendant clutched in his fist. And though the villagers pretended not to notice, every pair of eyes followed him. They knew where he had been. And worse, they knew what that meant. The village was too quiet when Adrian returned from the forest, even quieter than usual. He could feel the eyes on him, watching from behind half-closed shutters, peering through gaps in curtains. Mothers pulled their children indoors when he passed, doors shutting with a soft finality that carried more fear than words ever could. They knew where he had gone. They knew he had stepped into the forest, into the place no one dared to tread. Adrian's clothes were torn, his face scratched from branches. His lantern still flickered faintly, though the oil was nearly gone. But the thing he clutched in his fist, the pendant, was what kept the villagers' eyes on him. They recognized it. Mara's pendant, a ghost of a life taken too soon, proof of what they all already feared but never dared to face. Yet not one of them spoke. By dusk, the air shifted. Adrian felt it, the way a man feels a storm before it breaks. The pressure, the stillness, the breathless pause. was. Clouds rolled over the moon, smothering its pale glow, and the entire village seemed to sink into shadow. Doors locked, windows latched, lamps extinguished. The people hid, but their silence betrayed them. They were not protecting themselves. They were waiting. Adrian refused to hide. He stood in the square, the pendant around his neck, Mara's name burning on his tongue. He was tired of their silence, tired of the cowardice that had fed this curse for generations. That was when the whispers began. Soft at first, curling up from the well like smoke. Familiar, almost soothing, like a lullaby hummed by a mother. But then more voices joined, layer upon layer, weaving together into a chorus that rose with the wind. They filled the square, echoing against stone walls, pressing into Adrian's skull until his vision swam. He staggered back, hands pressed over his ears. But it didn't matter. The voices were inside him. Adrian, please like this video, comment your thoughts, and subscribe this channel. The sound twisted, turning cruel, laughter threading through the syllables of his name. His lantern sputtered violently, its flame stretching long and thin before snapping back to life. Shadows rippled across the cobblestones, not cast by the lantern, but moving against it, sliding, crawling, writhing like living things. He spun around, chest heaving, as the shadow slithered up walls, across rooftops, through door cracks. Pale hands pressed against windows from the inside as villagers watched in terror, unwilling to open their doors, unwilling to intervene. Then came the mist. It rose from the well in slow tendrils, curling and twisting like fingers reaching out. The smell hit Adrian first. Rot, damp earth, something long drowned but not decayed. The mist spread across the square, coating the stones, seeping into his lungs with every breath. He coughed, but the whispers only grew louder, the mist vibrating with their voices. And then shapes formed in it. Faces. Mara's among them. Her hollow eyes stared at him, her lips parted, her voice one of the countless whispering in unison. Behind her, others appeared, the missing villagers, men and women he had only glimpsed in portraits or heard described. Their features blurred and melted, but their eyes remained. Always the eyes, black, empty, endless. They reached for him, their mist hands stretching, clawing, desperate. Adrian's instinct screamed to run, but his feet rooted to the stones. The voices weren't just calling, they were pulling. His body leaned forward against his will, his chest tightening as though invisible cords were binding him. The pendant around his neck burned hot, searing against his skin. He yanked it off and clutched it in his fist, the chain cutting into his palm. The moment he held it up, the whispers faltered. Just slightly. The mist recoiled as though something unseen had been challenged. Mara's face flickered, distorted, her voice rising in a wail that cut through the others. "Mara! Mara! Mara!" Adrian shouted, his voice cracking against the storm of sound. "What do you want from me?" The whispers stopped. The silence that followed was worse. For one heartbeat, everything in the square froze. The mist hung motionless. The shadows paused mid-crawl. Even the air refused to move. Then, from deep within the well, a sound rose. Not a whisper this time. A growl, low, guttural, ancient. The stones trembled, and the ground beneath Adrian's boots quivered as if something immense was shifting below. The villagers screamed from inside their homes, though none dared open their doors. Adrian backed away, his lantern trembling in his grip. The mist surged suddenly, lashing toward him, cold fingers brushing his face, his arms, his chest. The pendant in his hand pulsed, light spilling faintly from its cracks, pushing the mist back for an instant before it surged again. From the well, a figure began to rise. Not flesh, not bone, something in between. A mass of shadow and water, its form ever changing, its limbs stretching too far, its face a blur of dozens layered atop each other. Its eyes, when they opened, were endless voids that swallowed the lantern light whole. The villagers had been right to hide. This was what they feared every week. This was the price of their survival. And Adrian was standing in the middle of it. The figure's mouth opened, wide and jagged, and the voices returned all at once. "It is your turn." The night had nearly broken Adrian. The whispers, the shadows, the mist, they clung to his skin and sank into his bones. Even when the figure dissolved back into the well, retreating with its endless voices, he could still feel it breathing in the dark. When the first light of dawn crept into the square, the villagers dared to unbolt their doors and peek outside. They saw Adrian standing there, pale, trembling, clutching Mara's pendant like a man holding on to his last prayer. And still, not one of them spoke. That silence was the final crack in Adrian's patience. Enough was enough. He stormed to the elder's house, kicking the door open with a force that rattled the frame. The elder, Jonas, a man with a beard as white as bone and eyes clouded by time, sat in the shadows by his hearth, waiting as though he had known Adrian would come. "You knew?" Adrian hissed. His voice was raw, scraped from shouting against the voices of the night. "Where? When? How? Come." "You've always known, and you let it happen." Jonas's face didn't change. His hands, knotted with age, rested on the head of his cane. His eyes, clouded but not blind, lifted to meet Adrian's. "Sit," he said softly. "If you want answers, you'll hear them here, not in the street." Adrian slammed the door shut and stood instead, his chest heaving. "Then speak. Tell me what that thing is. Tell me why you let your people die week after week as if it's nothing." The elder's gaze dropped to the fire. The flames flickered weakly, their smoke curling like thin fingers into the air. "Because if we don't," Jonas said, "we all die. Not just the village, the land itself, the rivers, the fields, the forest, everything. You saw what waits below. It is not just hunger, it is survival." Adrian's jaw clenched. That's not survival. That's slavery. Jonas closed his eyes, his words coming slowly, as if each carried the weight of centuries. Long ago, when famine struck, our people faced ruin. Crops failed, livestock starved, children withered before their mothers' eyes. They prayed to their God, but their prayers went unanswered. And so they turned to something else, the well. Adrian's stomach twisted as he remembered the altar in the forest, the bones scattered like broken promises. They begged, Jonas continued. They offered the well their blood, and in return, the fields turned green again. The river ran full. We were saved, but bargains made in desperation are not bargains at all. They are chains. It demanded a soul each week. At first, they gave it willingly. Criminals, thieves, outsiders. Then the old, the sick. But time wears down mercy, stranger. Eventually, there were no easy choices left, and so the well began to take what it wanted. Adrian's hands shook with rage. And you just accept it? You let your children, your friends, vanish into that thing because some desperate fools made a pact generations ago? Jonas's eyes opened again, and for the first time they held something sharp, something unyielding. You think we haven't tried? His voice cracked with sudden fury. You think we haven't fought? There were uprisings, fires, attempts to seal the well with stone, with iron, with prayer. Each time the land punished us. The river poisoned, the fields rotted, plague swept through. The bargain is not with us alone, it is with the world around us. We are bound by it, stranger, just as you are bound the moment you heard its whispers. The words struck Adrian like a blow. Bound. He remembered Ilara's warning, the way the voices had spoken his name, the way the mist had reached for him. Jonas leaned forward, his voice dropping to a grave whisper. Do you understand now? Better one soul a week than the world consumed. Adrian's stomach churned. You're sacrificing your people to protect the rest of the world. That's your justification? The elder's eyes glistened with something between shame and resignation. It is not justification. It is necessity. We live with our guilt so that others may live without it. That is our curse. Adrian shook his head, his fists clenching. No, that thing doesn't get to decide who lives and who dies. You've all let it feed for too long. Jonas's gaze darkened. Careful, boy. Defiance has a price. You think you can fight what has fed for centuries? You think what? You think your stubbornness makes you stronger than the hunger? You are already marked. It will come for you next. And no pendant, no anger, no will of yours will stop it. That eerie bite, this dread. The room fell into silence, the fire crackling softly between them. Adrian felt the weight of Jonas's words pressing down on him, but he refused to bow. He turned, gripping the doorframe as though it might hold him up. "If that thing wants me," Adrian muttered, his voice low and steady, "then let it come. But I won't go quietly. But I won't go quietly." Jonas's reply followed him out, carried on the trembling air like a warning and a curse. None ever do, and none ever win. The village changed as the week drew to its end. The air grew heavier, as though the sky itself was lowering to press down on the roofs. The people spoke even less than usual. No children played in the lanes. No women gossiped at the riverbank. Even the dogs seemed to sense what was coming, whining and scratching at doors until they were dragged inside. It was the night before the offering, the night everyone knew the well would claim its due. Adrian stood in the square, lantern in hand, staring at the black mouth of the well. He felt it pulling at him, not with chains or hands, but with something deeper, like the tug of the tide against a ship. Ilara had warned him. Jonas had told him the truth. The whispers had already named him. There was no doubt. He was the week's sacrifice. But Adrian was not a man who surrendered. He spent the day preparing. He returned to the forest, to the clearing where the altar stood among the twisted trees. The bones still lay scattered, staring at him with empty sockets. He knelt at the stone and traced the carved symbols etched into its surface, their grooves sharp even after centuries. They glowed faintly beneath his fingers, cold as ice, alive with something old and hungry. Adrian pulled the shard of stone he had broken free days earlier from his satchel. The markings on it still pulsed faintly. He gripped it hard, his knuckles white. It wasn't much, but it was something. Proof that the hunger could be touched, resisted, maybe even hurt. He whispered a vow under his breath. "If I go into the dark, I will not go alone." By the time he returned, night had fallen. The village was locked tight, every door barred, every window shuttered. Not a soul stirred. But Adrian knew they were watching, their eyes pressed to cracks in wood, their ears straining for the sound they dreaded. The square was empty but for him and the well. At first, silence, then the air shifted, the fog rolling in thicker than ever, swallowing the lantern's light. Adrian stood his ground, the shard clutched in one hand, Mara's pendant in the other. The whispers began. "Adrian!" The sound was stronger now, each syllable vibrating in his chest. He gritted his teeth, refusing to flinch. "It is your turn." The mist poured from the well, flooding the square, coiling around his feet like snakes. Faces formed in it again. Mara, the villagers, strangers long forgotten. Their mouths moved in unison, their hollow eyes fixed on him. They stretched their hands, beckoning, pleading, commanding. Adrian raised the pendant high, the broken chain glinting faintly. For a heartbeat, the faces flickered, wavering like candlelight in the wind. He tightened his grip on the shard of stone. The whispers screamed. From the depths of the well, it rose. The figure of shadows and water, larger this time, more defined. its limbs stretched impossibly long, dragging across the stones. Its face shifted constantly. Mara's, Jonas's, Ilara's, countless others, blurring together into a monstrous mask of the lost. Its mouth gaped wide, endless, and the voices thundered. "Give yourself." Adrian's breath came hard, his heart pounding. He stepped forward instead of back, shouting into the roar. "No!" His voice cracked but carried, echoing against the stone walls of the square. "No! You've taken enough. You've fed long enough." The mist surged at him, slamming against his chest, cold as the grave. He staggered, but stayed on his feet, driving the shard of stone into the ground before him. The markings flared bright, light searing through the mist. The shadow figure shrieked, its many mouths splitting wide, the sound rattling the houses. For a moment, Adrian saw it falter. For a moment, he believed he had hurt it. The whispers turned to screams. The mist lashed violently, slamming him to his knees. His lantern shattered, plunging the square into darkness, lit only by the glow of the shard. The figure leaned closer, its endless faces twisting, its black eyes filling his vision. "You cannot stop hunger," it hissed. Adrian lifted the shard again, holding it to his chest. The markings burned into his palm, pain searing through him. But he forced his voice out through gritted teeth. "Then, if you want me, take me, but I'll drag you with me." The square shook. The stones cracked beneath him. The well groaned, its ancient walls splitting, smoke and mist pouring from the fractures. The villagers screamed from their homes, though none came to help. The last thing Adrian saw was the figure lunging, its arms stretching, its mouth opening wider than the square itself. And then the world went white. When dawn broke, the village was silent. The mist was gone. The whispers that had haunted the air for centuries had vanished with it. For the first time in living memory, the square lay empty, the well cracked and smoking, its stones split down the middle like the shell of something rotten. Birds returned to the rooftops, their chirping uncertain, as if they too could not believe the silence was real. The villagers crept from their homes one by one, their faces pale with fear. They walked slowly, as though afraid the act of stepping into the square might awaken what had been buried. Mothers clutched their children close, men tightened their grips on useless tools, and old women crossed themselves again and again. Ilara was among them. She leaned heavily on her cane, her sharp eyes fixed on the ruined well. She muttered words under her breath, prayers or curses, no one could tell. For decades she had warned them. For decades she had been mocked. And now she saw it. The silence she had never thought she would live to hear. But Adrian was gone. There was no body, no trace. Only the shard of stone he had carried, cracked in half and lying beside the broken rim of the well. The pendant he had found, Mara's pendant, was gone too, as though taken back into the dark. The villagers stared at the well, their faces hollow with uncertainty. Had the curse been broken? Had Adrian defeated the hunger, or had he simply taken its place. They did not know, and no one dared to speak the question aloud. Days passed, then weeks. No one disappeared. For the first time, a week ended without loss. Families wept, not with grief, but with relief. Children played again in the lanes. Men sang as they worked the fields. Women laughed by the river. The village breathed for the first time in centuries. Yet the silence carried its own unease. The villagers avoided the square. They did not touch the well, though it no longer whispered. They rebuilt their lives around it, but never over it. At night, some swore they still felt something watching. Not the chorus of voices that had once filled the air, but a single presence. One voice, Adrian's voice. Ilara heard it first. Late one night, she rose to fetch water and passed the cracked well. She paused, her cane tapping against the stones, her breath caught in her throat. The silence was thick, oppressive. Then, faintly, she heard it. Ilara! Her name carried on the wind, soft as a sigh. She froze, her skin prickling, her eyes wet with sudden tears. She knew that voice. Not the hungers, not the many-layered whispers of the lost. This was the stranger's voice, Adrian's. She leaned closer, her hands trembling. "What are you?" she whispered. The air stirred. The faintest echo rose from the well. "I am here." Ilara staggered back, clutching her chest. She told no one, not yet. But others began to hear it too. Snatches of a man's voice in the dark, calling names, murmuring words no one could understand. The villagers whispered among themselves. Had Adrian sacrificed himself to seal the hunger? Or had he become part of it? Was he savior or prisoner? No answer came. The weeks turned to months. The disappearances never resumed. The fields flourished, the river flowed strong, the children grew tall. But the well remained, cracked yet unbroken, silent yet alive. Sometimes, on nights when the fog crept low and the air pressed heavy, a brave soul would walk into the square and lean close to the rim. If they were foolish enough to listen carefully, they swore they heard it, a single voice, patient and steady, waiting in the dark. A voice that was not hunger, but not human anymore either. A voice that whispered with Adrian's tone. And though the village celebrated its freedom, a deeper fear took root. Because silence was never permanent here. Hunger did not die. It only changed its form. One day, they feared, the voice in the well would not remain alone. One day, it would begin to whisper again, not many voices, but one by one, until the square filled with them once more. The village lived, but the shadow of the well remained. Because even silence has teeth. And it is always waiting to bite. Please like this video and subscribe to my channel. That's free and only way to support us. Thank you.